Her Smoke Rose Up Forever by James Tiptree Jr., published in 1990, is a collection of short stories by James Tiptree Jr. that were published in various science fiction magazines throughout the late 1960s all the way through to the early 1980s. And for the uninitiated, James Tiptree Jr. was actually a pen name for a female science fiction writer, Alice Sheldon. And there is an introduction here from Michael Swanwick, and I've not read any of Swanwick's work, but in the introduction he goes over the really interesting and strange life of Alice Sheldon, touching on why she decided to adopt this pen name, which was predominantly because she had become known as the woman who did this and that, the woman who did this, the woman who is amazing at this, and she wanted to prove her writing ability on its own merits, with an additional reason potentially being that it would have been easier to get her work published in the science fiction magazines under a male name. And also she had a career and affiliation with the CIA, which she wanted to distance herself from in her writing career. Alice Sheldon's life sadly came to quite a tragic end, and I found that this introduction from Michael Swanwick was really powerful and quite moving. So what I'm going to do here is talk about each story individually, give a very quick summary and my thoughts about it, and then I'll summarize my overall thoughts about the collection at the end. So the book opens with a story called The Last Flight of Dr. Ain, which is following this doctor who is traveling around the world, stopping off at major airports in various cities, and he is seemingly being haunted by visions of this sickly woman accompanying him on his journey. And in the midst of all of this, you find out that there is this global issue of a leukemia virus affecting populations across the world. From that, maybe you can tell where it's going. This doctor is on his way to a conference in Moscow. I still thought that the ending of the story was impactful and dark, and probably does set the tone for the rest of this collection. And that's not just because of that tone, it's because there is a certain opaque and confusing nature to the way that James Tiptree Jr. writes here, where your hand is not being held and you do need to read quite intently to figure out exactly what's going on for most of these stories. The second story here is The Screwfly Solution, which follows a man who is living and working in South America, trying to come up with a solution to a spreading population of cane flies that are devastating crops in the local area. He is receiving letters from his wife back home in the United States and from one of his friends, and in those letters they are telling him of a gradually expanding phenomenon of these groups of men referring to themselves as the Cult of Adam, who have established these what they call liberated zones throughout the United States, where within these liberated zones they are murdering all girls and women. And as this issue is seemingly escalating through these letters, the doctor decides that he's going to return to the United States to be with his wife and daughter. And on the way back, he starts to experience violent thoughts about women himself. Again, halfway through this one, I started to theorize about what was actually going on here, and I turned out to be right about that. I don't think it's incredibly difficult to do that. But again, it didn't lessen the blow. I think this one is incredibly impactful, harrowing, and shockingly relevant today. We then get into a story called The Girl Who Was Plugged In, which is a sort of proto-cyberpunk story following this crippled girl who is navigating her way through this city, which is extremely futuristic in nature. There are all of these holographic projections constantly marketing various products and services to its inhabitants. And after she attempts suicide, she is recovered by a mysterious benefactor who recruits her into entering a machine in which she is plugged in, and her consciousness is transferred into this young, perfect, synthetic avatar-like body for the purpose of marketing products or services. And during this time that she is within this artificial body, she falls in love with someone, and this leads to a completely tragic and disturbing ending. So those two stories back to back really affected me early on in this collection, and The Girl Who Was Plugged In particular really did hit on all of those themes that have become common in the cyberpunk subgenre. And I would be incredibly shocked if William Gibson hadn't read this story and been influenced by it when he wrote Neuromancer. And I've not looked into that, so I'm not 100% sure. But there's just so much of Neuromancer's DNA wrapped up in this strange little short story. The next one is The Man Who Walked Home, which is following a man who is kind of flickering through time after a devastating event. And again, this is one that requires a little bit of patience in terms of actually figuring out what's going on. It's quite confusing at first, and that theme, again, like I mentioned earlier, continues all the way through this collection. The next one is called And I Have Come Upon This Place by Lost Ways, which follows a scientist who is convinced that he's detected an anomaly on an alien planet, but his peers don't necessarily believe him. So he travels on his own to this alien planet and ventures into the mountains to investigate this anomaly. Along the way, he encounters these alien beings who are sort of like these humanoid marsupial creatures that are furry apart from their heads that are smooth and described like giant olives. This story and the one before, again, I do feel like there is a bit of a lack of clarity. This one also goes on for a little bit too long, in my opinion. There's a really long build-up of the scientist on this spaceship before he even goes to this planet that I probably could have done without. But then there is an ending which has quite far-reaching consequences that I did enjoy. So already you're sort of seeing that some of these stories are really hitting for me, and then others I'm not getting along with as well, which is typical of short story collections in my own personal experience. And I've yet to find one where I've truly loved every single short story included. Next up, we've got The Women Men Don't See. This follows a man who is heading to Mexico on a fishing trip on his own, and he charters a plane to take him out to some remote waters to go on this fishing trip, and he is accompanied by a mother and daughter. And on the way, they encounter a storm and they are involved in a plane crash, which leaves them stranded on a remote section of the Mexican coastline. And then it gets into a bit of a survivalist story. And it's difficult to really say why this one ends up being science fiction without spoiling it, so I'm not really going to do that. But I did think that the ending, again, was really impactful, and I did just quite like the journey of these characters and this survivalist tale. So this is one of the better ones, along with the two that I mentioned earlier on. And then we've got one called Your Faces, Oh My Sisters, Your Faces Filled of Light, which follows a young girl traveling through this bizarre, seemingly post-apocalyptic world, and she is referring to the fact that she is making deliveries along some kind of predetermined routes. But then actually what's going on is that this girl seems to be an escaped patient from a mental health institution who has undergone electric shock therapy and is experiencing the world in a completely different light to the rest of the characters. And you flipped between reality as seen by some of these characters and then reality as seen by this girl making her way across this world and through these cities. And she sees everyone she encounters as a woman and refers to all of them as her sisters. And this one had a completely shocking, disturbing, and horrible ending that I read just before going to bed one night, and it honestly kept me up. And I've been thinking about it for days since I read it. This one really knocked me off center. And while that is something I'm increasingly seeking out in the work that I'm reading, I don't think that these stories will be for everyone just because of the nature of the content included here. That is difficult to read and digest at times. But I do think that this one is incredibly well done and potentially my favourite in the entire collection. Next up then, we've got a story called Houston, Houston, Do You Read, which follows a group of men who are on a circumsolar mission. So they're flying around the sun and coming back to Earth, and they encounter another ship who tells them that they've actually been lost to time, and through potential solar flare activity, they have jumped a few hundred years into the future, and that Earth is not the way that they remember it. I think that this one had a really good idea at its centre, but something that Tiptree does in this story is make the men into really cartoonish villains with dialogue that is embarrassingly bad and cringe-inducing to read. And pretty much all of the stories in here have some kind of feminist bent to them, and in many cases, that's to the story's benefit. In this one, I just don't think the writing quality was anywhere near some of the stories that I've already discussed in this collection, and this one ended up frustrating me due to its wasted potential. Next up, we've got a story called With Delicate Mad Hands, which follows a woman who has some kind of mutation that makes her look vaguely like a pig, and she is bullied for this and treated really badly. But throughout her life, she's had this voice calling out to her to travel to the stars, to seek out something called, I think it's the Empire of the Pigs or the Planet of the Pigs or something like that. And so she does exactly that. She ends up hatching a plan to hijack a spaceship and go out on this journey to the stars. This ends up going to some incredibly weird places that I think were really entertaining to read for the most part, but again, there is a quite sad, depressing tone to this story, which isn't going to be for everyone. I do think that the story probably drags a little bit as well, which is a criticism I have for quite a few of these stories. They are a little bit longer than they probably need to be. They do overstay their welcome, and they do have these bloated midsections that made me switch off a number of times, even though some of the endings did hit home and reel me back in. But I do think there could have been a little bit more discipline in some of these stories and a little bit more focus, and this is one of those examples. The next one then is called A Momentary Taste of Being, which involves a colonization mission to an alien planet. These scientists aboard this ship are analysing the planet to determine whether it is safe for humans to live there, and they encounter this strange plant-like alien, which is described as a sort of giant cabbage with these nodule-like pieces described as a bundle of grapes. And this alien plant life is seemingly having an effect on the minds of this crew. And in a way, this reminded me of Solaris. And the reveal as to the theory about this planet and about this plant life is really fascinating and really quite unique. But again, I do think there is a lack of clarity in terms of the characters, in terms of the character voices, and in terms of the descriptions of certain events. So the central idea is very good, but I do think the writing is quite clunky. Next up is a story called We Who Stole the Dream, which is about a group of aliens who are being oppressed by humans on a planet, and they hijack a spaceship called the Dream. And again, the treatment of these aliens by these humans, by these human men, is extremely brutal, extremely hard to read at times. But there is a kind of satisfying resolution of these aliens making this escape plan. There is a little bit of tension that comes through in the story. And it gave me the same sort of feeling as the film District 9, with a little bit less of an action focus. The next one's called Love is the Plan. The Plan is Death. Some of these story titles are incredible, by the way. And this one is told from the perspective of this weird monster creature who is encountering the life cycle of its own species, which involves cannibalism and bizarre mating rituals. Again, because Tiptree is writing from a completely alien perspective, sometimes it is difficult to grasp exactly what this character is referring to, what they look like, and what this world looks like. But it's an interesting one nonetheless. The titular story then, Her Smoke Rose Up Forever, is following a guy who is heading out on this boat on this icy river, and he falls into the water, which results in the story flitting around between these fragmented memories, which initially left me confused until I sat and thought about the story for a couple of days. And I do have a bit of a theory as to what's actually going on here, but I can't really talk about that without getting into spoilers too much. But I do think it involves a certain technology, but I'm not going to say any more than that. I can't say that I enjoyed this one really, mostly due to that confusion that arises from the way that this story is delivered. And I'm not sure I'm as interested in these particular events to do that extra work and really hone in on that theory and think more about it. I'm just quite happy to move on from this one. Next is On the Last Afternoon, which follows a stranded human colony who are living on this planet after having crash landed, and they are living on this space by the coast, which seems to be arable land. And then they encounter these enormous titanic sea monsters and witness their violent and bizarre mating rituals. And while I didn't really love this story overall, there is a certain dark, distinct visual quality about it and an otherworldly feeling that was really satisfying to experience. She Waits for All Men Born is the next one, and this follows an immortal woman with a deadly psychic power. Similar to some of the stories I've talked about before, I think there's a real lack of clarity in Tiptree's writing here, and not in a way that's satisfying to dig into in my opinion, so this one sort of went in and then straight back out again. The penultimate story is Slow Music, which is set in what I think is a far future Earth, where humans have seemingly mostly left the planet, being drawn to something referred to as the river. We are following a guy who is travelling on this river, or travelling to this river, where he encounters a human woman who is living quite a primitive lifestyle, and she tries to convince him to stay with her and reproduce, which she can only do through the consumption of a certain kind of pill. And again, this one has a really otherworldly feeling, which was a little bit more satisfying to try and understand, because Tiptree is seeding more obvious clues along the way before you reach that conclusion and start to determine for yourself what the river actually is or represents. And then the final story here is called And So On and So On, which follows a spaceship crew discussing that there is nothing left for humans to explore or discover in the universe. And I think the ending of this one is actually quite fitting to end this collection of short stories, because James Tiptree Jr, or Alice Sheldon, is somebody who was really pushing the boundaries of the genre and exploring the depths of what you could actually do with it in a way that I don't think was always incredibly successful. But that pursuit of the unknown is really admirable and ends up leading to some really incredible places at times, and some scary places. So overall, I feel like the book is uneven. I feel like there's a lot of clunky writing, and there is a certain lack of clarity that can be incredibly frustrating if you're not willing to do a really deep and intent read of these stories, which ultimately comes down to Tiptree not holding your hand through these. And I mentioned William Gibson already, who's a writer who does a similar thing, I think. But I think the consistent quality of Gibson's writing carries you along in a way that you don't always get from James Tiptree Jr, in my experience, from this collection. But it was dark, it was unsettling and disturbing, and it did knock me off centre, which is something that I'm seeking out more and more in my science fiction reading. And it is rare to find something that seeps into your mind and stays with you long after you finish reading it. And some of these stories in here did have that effect on me. So the fact that I was moved as much as I was by some of these stories, the fact that I was moved as much as I was by this introduction from Michael Swanwick, tells me that there is something really valuable in this collection. But I would definitely not recommend this to many readers of science fiction, particularly newcomers to the genre, because I think you would potentially have the experience of bouncing off it and being left with that frustration. But if you are someone that is willing to go on some of these journeys and tackle some of this more challenging work, I do think that the highs are incredibly high, even if you have to trudge your way through some of those low lows. So I was thinking a little bit about this uneven nature that I was experiencing, and I realised that these stories were published under the names of James Tiptree Jr, Alice Sheldon, and then another pen name that she sometimes used, which was Raccoona Sheldon. And in the introduction, Michael Swanwick talks about how within her house she had 3 separate typewriters set up for each one of these personalities. And I think it's possible that she actually managed to achieve a completely different mindset while writing under these pseudonyms. And that's why I'm experiencing these ups and downs, along with the fact that they were written over a period of 20 or so years. So that's everything I wanted to speak about today. Please do go and look into the life of Alice Sheldon or James Tiptree Jr. if it's something that is intriguing to you. I'm sure there are videos on YouTube of people going through her life story, which is fascinating, it is dark, and it is tragic. And if anything I've said there does intrigue you, you can probably find some of those individual short stories rather than going out and buying this entire collection. Thank you very much for watching, liking, and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.